If you're a guest with us today, we have been on a year-long study of lessons from the Old Testament people of faith. And these are lessons that are taken from character studies of different individuals. We've looked at Job and Abraham. We spent time with Joseph and Moses and Joshua. And we are now in the book of Ruth. And, you know, one of the things you need to understand about our Bibles is that our Bibles are divided up into two parts. You have an Old Testament, which is God's covenant with ancient Israel, and God looking forward to making a covenant with all of the earth, which we're a part of. And then you have the New Testament, which is that covenant. In fact, Lee led us in communion a while ago, and that communion is a celebration of the covenant that Jesus has entered into with us through his body and through his blood. And so we're in the book of Ruth. And as I said when we launched this series, this is the Old Testament Hallmark channel. Every time I read in the book of Ruth, I'm like, man, this is a movie. I mean, it's got all the turns, it's got all the twists, it's got all the drama of a great Hallmark movie, except it was written, some 3,000 years ago. And so we've been working our way through it, and let me just give you a little background, if you've not been part of our series, where we're at. The story is about a woman by the name of Naomi, whose husband is named Elimelech. Elimelech means, my God is king. They are a part of the first generation that rises up after they conquer the promised land. Okay? And you say, how do you know that? Because one of the other characters is a man named Boaz, and Boaz's mother was, and my brain just went dead on me, is Rahab, who of course was there at Jericho when the Israelites came in to start conquering the land. So we know it's that first generation. Now, Naomi has two sons, Chilion and Mahlon, and they're living in Bethlehem. They're from the tribe of Judah. And unfortunately, this first generation, after the original generation, began to leave the Lord. They began to go after other gods. And because of this, God begins to punish them in order to draw them back to him. And among the punishments, at least for Bethlehem, was a famine. So famine hits the land, and because of that, Elimelech makes a decision. Now, the decision he should have made was to realize that the people were going astray, to seek God's help in bringing the people back. He should have hung in there and prayed to God and been an example there in the Bethlehem community. But instead, he bails. He says to Naomi, listen, there's bread over in Moab. There are distant cousins. Let's go over there and live. And so he packs up the family and they move to Moab. Something that, God said, listen, I'm giving you this land. Don't you go and live among, the nations around you. And don't you intermarry with them, because if you do, it's going to pull you away. Well, everything God told him not to do, Elimelech does. And so he goes over and he lives in Moab, and he's going to be there, at least Naomi's going to be there about 10 years. But when he gets there, he dies. And so now she's got two sons. They're of marriage age, and they need wives. And so she arranges marriages, Orpah and Ruth, for her two sons, Chilion and Mahlon. And then the sons die. Now, we don't know how long the sons and daughter-in-laws were married. We don't know that. We don't know when, after they got there, that Elimelech died. We just know they're there about 10 years. And so Ruth, after the two sons dies, says, listen, I hear that the famine has eased in Bethlehem. Let's go back there. And as she's preparing to go, she realizes, do I really want to take two Moabite daughters-in-law back to Israel? And so she pleads for them not to go. And you may remember that Orpah decides she's going to go back to her family, to her gods, and she doesn't go with Naomi, but Ruth doesn't. Ruth pleads with her mother-in-law, entreat me not to leave you. Your people are going to be my people, and your God's going to be my God. And where you live, I'm going to live. And where you die, I'm going to die. Beautiful, beautiful dedication of this daughter-in-law to her mother-in-law. And so they go back home. And they get back, and everybody sees Naomi when she walks in. Is this Naomi? And Naomi says, don't call me Naomi. Naomi, by the way, means pleasant. She says, call me Mari. Mari means bitter. She said, I left full, but I've come back empty. The hand of God's been so difficult upon me. And so you have that tragedy. And of course they get back, and Ruth immediately has to find food. And they have this tradition, it's a command of God in Israel, that the poor could go and they could glean behind those who were cutting the barley and were cutting the wheat. They could go in behind them and pick up whatever fell on the ground and whatever, sheaves were dropped. And so Ruth goes and does that. And of course the text says that by happenstance, they ended up in the field of Boaz. But we as Christians know there's no such thing as happenstance. What happens because God is in charge. Jesus is on the throne. That's why everything happens the way it happens. Not that it's preordained, not that it's premeditated by God, every detail, but God is in charge, and we need to understand that. And so Ruth goes out and she begins to glean, and Boaz shows up just at that moment and says, whose woman is this? Well, this is Ruth the Moabitess who came back with Naomi, and his heart goes out to her. And let me remind you why. Because Boaz's mother was a Canaanite. Boaz's mother was a harlot. Boaz's mother was someone who converted to the Israelite faith, and a man by the name of Salmon took the chance in marrying her. And because of that, they settled there in Bethlehem, and Boaz grew up, and God blessed him richly. His mother was an outsider. And so Boaz's heart goes out to Ruth. And so Boaz basically tells her, don't you go anywhere else and glean. You stay right in my fields. He had a lot of fields. You get your barley here, you get your wheat here. I'm going to tell my guys not to bother you. In fact, he then loads her up and gives her a lot of extra. He invites her over to eat with him. Says you can go drink out of the water jars. He's just as kind as he can be. Him being up in his 40s, very likely, and her being, maybe in her early 20s, or maybe a late teenager. That's where we end up last week, and we pick up today. Ruth 2:22. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for Boaz. Because if so, in someone else's field, you might be harmed. So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished. And she lived with her mother-in-law. And that last line tells you where we're going next. Okay? And so they get there. It's kind of late March, early April is when the barley harvest is coming in, and then the wheat. So by now it maybe it's June, late June. And so she's been working now in these fields for 3 or 4 months. And now Naomi decides it's time to act. And let me just go ahead and tell you, what we read next will just kind of freak you out. You're like, okay, what in the world is going on? So let's dive in. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, my daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided. Now, she had already said this when they were back in Moab. You go back to Ruth chapter 1, and she said, y'all need to go back to your father's, to your mother's house, and find another man to be your husband so that you can have a family. And Orpah says yes, and Ruth says no. And so now Ruth is in Bethlehem, and Naomi's like, I've got to find you a husband. All right? And of course, that is so strange to us today. Let's be honest. I didn't want anybody finding me a wife except me. Right? As much as I love my dad and appreciate my dad, I didn't want my dad doing it. I sure didn't want my mother doing it. I just kind of like the idea of being able to do that myself. But in the ancient world, most marriages were prearranged, and Ruth was, she was fine with that. She understood the culture. And then Naomi says this, now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. In other words, she is a cousin of Elimelech. He is a cousin. Now, how close Boaz was, we don't know. But it's fairly close. Okay, we're going to see that, especially next week as we get in the text. And then it's when Naomi says, okay, here's what I want you to do. I mean, you can almost see Naomi mulling over this for days. The end of the wheat harvest is here. I've got to act quick. And so she comes up with a plan. And I want you to look at what she says. Tonight, he's going to be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. In other words, they're going to be finishing up the harvest. And that was a process of where you beat out the stalks and you get the wheat, and then you separate the chaff from the wheat, and then you'd bag up the wheat, and that's what you would eat on for the next several months. Number 3, verse 3, wash, put on perfume. Don't miss that. Don't miss that. You see, perfume was created by the devil to catch men. Right? Put on perfume. Put on your best clothes. I mean, a lot of us can think back on that first date, right, with our spouse. And I mean, the first date I ever had with June was a banquet. She come out with a long dress. I had her a corsage, you know. I mean, I picked her up in my brand new car. I mean, my parents had brought me a brand new car to go to Freed Hardeman. And I pulled up in that Ford Pinto, and she was so excited to... Listen, I hear a lot of my friends talk about the cars, the first cars they had, and I'm like, I had a Pinto, but it was new, all right? Says, you go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you're there until he has finished eating and drinking. In other words, I need you to head down there to the threshing floor, but you stay hidden. And so you can see her dressed in her finest, perfume on, I mean, beautiful as she can be, and she's easing up to where they're finishing up. There's a fire raging, they're getting ready to go to sleep, but they've been eating and drinking. And said, you don't let him know you're there until he has finished eating and drinking when he lies down. Because at that time, they would protect their harvest by sleeping there, okay? And so he would have his workers sleep in the area, he would sleep in the area, they would protect the grain from wild animals or people trying to steal it. She says, you note the place where he lays down. Why? Because there's other people there. There's other workers there. There's other men there. So you note where you don't want to lay down at the wrong spot. Then go uncover his feet. And he will lie down, and he will tell you what to do. Now, back in biblical times, you wore a cloak. Your cloak was also your blanket, your cover at night. In fact, it was against the law to take someone's cloak as surety and not give it back to them before nightfall. You needed to have cover at night. And so he would lay down, cover himself. She's to come, take his cloak, take the tunic underneath, and uncover his feet. Now, there's a debate, and you can go and read about it online on how far up she uncovered his feet. Okay? I just know it was enough that eventually it got his attention. All right? And so you go and you do that. And Ruth says, I'll do whatever you say. And so she heads down to the threshing floor, did everything her mother-in-law said. And when Boaz had finally finished eating and drinking and he was in good spirits, y'all, he's feeling good. God's blessed them. They've had a great harvest. All the workers had finished. He's looking at all the barley and all the wheat he's got, and he's going, yes, this is going to be a good year. God's come through for us. So he's in good spirits, and he lies down at the far end of the grain pile. And Ruth approached quietly. I mean, there's other guys sleeping. She's not making a sound. Uncovers his feet and lays down. He doesn't wake up at first. He's tired. He's worked all day. He doesn't wake up. But my guess is the air starts getting cooler. And I don't know if you've ever gone to sleep with no cover, because it's hot, and then in the night it cools off and you wake up and you're like, whoa, I'm cold. He wakes up. It says in the text something startled him. I don't think it's Ruth snoring. I don't think she's asleep. But something startles him. I'm thinking maybe cold air. He turns, and there's a woman lying at his feet. Now you go, how did he know it was a woman? Do you remember what she put on? Perfume. And of course, it could have been the perfume that woke him up. Cold air, perfume. Anyway, there's a woman at his feet. And that's not something that happens every day, right? I mean, you wake up and there's somebody sleeping at your feet and you don't know who they are. And so Boaz is like, what in the world? Who are you? I'm your servant Ruth, she said. Now, I love what happens next because basically, if you go back in the text, Naomi has said, when he realizes you're there, you just do what he says. Ruth's not waiting. Ruth knows the Jewish law, the Israelite law. She knows what they're supposed to do, and she steps out. You're talking about bold. She is bold. And watch what she says. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you're a guardian redeemer of our family. Now, again, we read this and we go, what? Yeah, Eugene Peterson really helps us get an insight as to what she's actually saying here. Here's Peterson out of the Message. I am Ruth, your maiden. Take me under your protecting wing. Cloaks look like wings sometimes. And one of the ways, oftentimes you'd show someone your favor is to cover them with your cloak. She says, you take me, you cover me with your cloak. You're my close relative. You know, in the circle of covenant redeemers, you have the right to marry me. Wow. That's pretty bold. She's just basically saying, will you marry me? And you're thinking, shouldn't that come from the guy? Well, especially back then, yes. But you see the boldness of Ruth. And so you ask, what's going on? Why this tradition? Why is she so bold? What is going on here? And there's two things at play here. The first one's called the Levirate marriage. And it's not something we would do today, but boy, they did it, especially in ancient Israel. If brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, notice the language there, his widow must not marry outside the family. Must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her, marry her, fulfill the duty of the brother-in-law to her. Notice the language there, not the husband. Even though he is the husband, you're fulfilling the duty of the brother-in-law. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother, so that the name will not be blotted out from Israel. One of the things about ancient Israel is that you wanted descendants. You know, if you ask Israelites or ask Jews today, what's the first commandment found in the Bible? The first commandment is to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. Genesis 1. And so having kids was the first thing as a follower of God that you're supposed to do. And in this case, you want to have a son. Now, what if you only had daughters? Daughters could inherit land as well. It was one of the things that Moses had to inquire of the Lord. The Lord said, listen, man doesn't have son, the land goes to the daughters. And so even though it says here son, it would go to the daughters as well. And so this Levirate marriage was that someone in the family, if there was a brother, the brother needed to do it. If not, it would then go to the cousins. But someone needed to step up on behalf of the relative and have a son whose son, that son born, would not be attributed to, the father. It would be attributed to his brother or his cousin. And that was because family line was everything. That's why you turn to Matthew chapter 1 and you have the genealogy of Jesus and you're like, you got to be kidding me. Just out of curiosity, how many of you can tell me your great-great-great-grandmother on your dad's side's maiden name? Anybody do that? You know, we're not genealogists. Now, I am personally. I love genealogy. And I remember when I first started doing my family's genealogy, and I went to my grandmother and I said, Grandmother, what was great-great-granddaddy's wife's maiden name? And she said she was a beaver. And I said, she was a what? It said she was a beaver, B-E-A-V-E-R. I said, we got beavers in the family? And she's like, yeah. And so I began tracing it and became a member of Ancestry and everything. No. Bieber, B-I-E-B-E-R. So guess who I'm related to? Never mind. All right. we're big into genealogy. They were big into genealogy, much bigger than us. Now, the second thing's in play is the kinsman redeemer. It's not just having a son that would carry on the family line, but it's also keeping the land in the family. When the Israelites came into the promised land, Joshua divided the land up, giving different tribes different part of the land. That land had to stay in the family. It was passed down literally from generation to generation to generation. Notice the text here in Leviticus chapter 25. The land must not be sold permanently. In other words, if you sold the land, someone in the family had to eventually come and redeem it. And if that wasn't the case, in the year of Jubilee, it would go back to... God wanted the land to stay in these family units. And so those two things are what are at work here. In the story of Naomi, her husband, her two sons, Ruth's now dead husband, someone needs to keep his family name alive, and on top of that, they fix to have to sell the family farm in order to survive. Someone in the family needs to buy it. If one of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell some of their property, their nearest relative is to come and redeem it. That was the law. Okay? So Boaz knows that. He is familiar. He's second generation, but Joshua had taught the people what the law of Moses said. And so he responds, "The Lord bless you, my daughter. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You've not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor." What's Boaz saying? Boaz saying, "I've been watching you. You've not been flirting with the guys working in the fields. You've not been, joking with them. You've not been trying to meet them. You've not been doing any of that. You've not been running after them, whether they're rich or poor. That's not what you've done." And so he's like, I've noticed that. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. And by the way, this becomes one of the most important phrases in the whole thing. Everybody in town has been watching you. And you, by the way you've treated your mother-in-law, and by the way you've worked, and by the way you've taken care of her, know that you are a woman of noble character. That phrase, noble character, there is the exact same phrase used here in Proverbs 31, a wife of noble character. And by the way, depending on which order you have of the Old Testament books, you got to realize the way we order the Old Testament is not the way the Israelites ordered their books or the Jews ordered their books. And in some of the orders, the book of Ruth comes immediately after Proverbs 31. In other words, you have Proverbs, and then the next one is Ruth. And so, is Ruth an illustration of the noble woman? Well, whether it's not, it was designed that way, it definitely is that. And by the way, you go back to chapter 2, verse 1, Boaz is a man of standing. Exact same word. He's a person of character. And that leads us to our first lesson, which is very simple, and that is marriage is more about character than anything else. A woman who fears the Lord, a man who fears the Lord. When you're sitting there thinking about what would I like to have in a spouse, so oftentimes we come up with the craziest things in the world. I want to find someone who's wealthy. I want to find, a guy who's charming. I want to find a woman who's beautiful. I want to find someone who's going to inherit a lot. I want to find, and you just fill in the blank of all the reasons why we marry people. And yet the story of Ruth, if it teaches anything, is the most important thing about marriage is the character of the person you choose. And let me tell you, we could go around this auditorium this morning, couple after couple after couple. How long have you been married? I've been married 50 years. How long have you been married? I've been married 60 years. How long have you been married? I've been married 65 years. And you ask them why? Because I chose, or she chose, well. That's the difference. Although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there's another who is more closely related than I. Again, reading the book and just imagining it as a Hallmark movie, every time you see things going in the right direction, all at once here comes a curveball. Here's Ruth. She said, marry me. That's what she said. You marry me. You redeem me. And then all at once she hears the words that had to have broken her heart. As Boaz says, listen, I'd like to. But there's a relative closer and he's got first dibs. And all at once you can just see her go, oh, no. Naomi, your plan's not going to work. I mean, what if he does it? And you know, life throws us curves like that. We've all experienced them. I mean, have you ever applied for a job only to have them write a letter back saying you don't have enough experience? I mean, I remember when I was in my early 20s trying to get my first preaching job, every letter I got back said, you don't have experience. And I'm like, that's right. I'm in my early 20s. Give me some. Just take a risk on me, please. You know. And finally, when I got to be 31 years old, somebody said, okay, we're going to take a risk on this young guy. You know. Or maybe you've got a letter back saying you're overqualified. Boy, don't you love that one? I'm like, wait a minute, if I'm applying for a job, how can I be overqualified? That doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, life is constantly throwing us curveballs. And listen to what he says to Ruth here. He says, stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good. Again, you can hear Ruth going, no, I want to marry you. I mean, she's not saying it, but you know she's feeling it. But then she hears the words she wants to hear. But if he is not willing, as surely as Yahweh lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning. In other words, trust me. I've got this. And you know that's what God says to us. When we get a curve ball thrown at us in life, Peter says, cast those things, those anxieties on him. Why? Because he cares for you. Boaz cared for her. He was going to work it out. We're going to see that next week. God's going to work it out in our lives. I mean, even though we get those curved balls and we think sometimes, boy, this is not going to end well, God says, by the way, it's in my hands. Everything in my hands ends well. So she lay at his feet until the morning and got up before anyone could be recognized. In other words, she had to get out. By the way, you think she slept any? I mean, do you think she slept a wink? And I don't think Boaz slept any, unless he was just so tired he did. But she lays there, and then as she's getting up, he says, no one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor. In other words, you got to sneak out as quietly as you snuck in. And of course, you look at that and go, why? Well, you know why. I mean, Boaz said to all of his workers, okay, guys, we're finishing up. There ain't going to be no partying. There's not going to be women brought in. I mean, y'all, we're going to honor Yahweh, so don't you be sneaking anybody in. And then, of course, guess who had someone to sneak in? Boaz did. And so Boaz is like, okay, now listen, I know what you did is honorable. But if somebody sees you sneaking out, it's not going to look honorable. And so you got to sneak out where nobody knows you. And that leads us to lesson 3. A good reputation is essential for those who fear God. I can't emphasize that enough. I used to say to my boys, every time they would go out to do something as teenagers, I'd say, remember, you need to remember who you are. You're Chapman. But more than that, you need to remember whose you are. You belong to God. Don't dishonor God first, and please don't dishonor you and your mother. And that's what he's basically saying to her. A good name is more desirable than great riches. To be esteemed is better than silver or gold. I mean, your reputation matters. Bring me the shawl you're wearing and hold it out. And he did so. And he poured 6 measures of barley and placed the bundle on her. And then he went back to town. In other words, before you go home, though, I want to give you something. Now, again, we look at this and we go, okay, 6 measures of barley. Let's look at the NET, Stan. Again, gets it right. Hold out the shawl you're wearing. Grip it tightly. As she held it tightly, he measured out 60 pounds of barley. I mean, Ruth's strong. And he helps her get this on her shoulder, and she heads back. And I want you to notice, then he went into town. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi, how did it go, my daughter? Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, he gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, don't go back to your mother-in-law. empty-handed. In other words, he's not only caring for Ruth, he's caring for Naomi. Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today. Naomi had been watching Boaz and said, he is going to deal with this, and he's going to deal with it now. And I love that, because that leads us to our last lesson, which is some things don't need to wait until tomorrow. I don't know if you're a procrastinator. I am. I mean, I'm always putting things off. June's not. June's right the opposite. June's like, we need to clean out the attic. And I'm like, why do we need to clean out the attic? She says, so our boys won't have to when we're gone. And I'm like, well, they deserve to have to. You know, I mean, that's my approach. I mean, they were a burden to me when they were young, you know. But some things don't need to be put off. And let me tell you, there's one in particular that don't need to be put off. James 4 talks about James saying, listen, don't say today or tomorrow we'll go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money, because you don't know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? It's a mist that appears for a little while and then it's gone. As I mentioned earlier, my mother's only sister passed away this last week. My aunt would have turned 87 here in about 2 weeks. My mother had just turned 87 when she died. And you think 87 is a long time. It is a long time. And yet, in the scope of life, it's just a mist that appears for a little while and vanishes away. And because of that, Paul says, listen, I tell you, now is the time of God's favor. Now, of all the things not to put on, it is your faith in God through Jesus Christ. It is coming to Him in faith and being baptized. That is something you don't need to put off. In fact, the Hebrew writer put it this way, as has just been said, today if you hear His voice, don't harden your heart, because if you do, it's not you, it's Satan that's doing it. Don't let him do it. Boaz knew he had to act that day. Maybe today you need to act. And if you've got something you need that we can help with, assist you, whether it's being baptized or prayer, we'd be honored to do it. You can come right now as we stand and